Top European Union officials are accusing the United States of profiting from the war in Ukraine through high natural gas prices and weapons sales, while Europe struggles with rampant inflation and a cost of living crisis. Brussels argues that President Joe Biden's recently approved green subsidies and taxes severely damage European industry by making the trade relationship unbalanced and unfair. Amidst rising tensions, a meeting between French President Emmanuel Macron and his American counterpart in Washington saw both attempt to send a message of unity. So is the United States really taking advantage of the conflict in Ukraine? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. A transatlantic rift over Ukraine, energy and trade has sparked concerns in Europe that the United States is following a protectionist policy that discriminates against its allies. Ahead of his state visit to Washington, D.C., President Emmanuel Macron said that relations between Europe and the United States are, and I quote, out of sync. And he explained that Europe and the US must see eye to eye.
The purpose of this visit is to reinstall a strategic dialogue to resynchronize our agendas, because let's not be mistaken, there is a risk today and we must talk about it between friends. The risk is that faced with the challenges I talked about, the United States looks first at the United States, which is normal, we do the same for ourselves, then it looks at its rivalry with China, and so Europe, therefore France, becomes a kind of adjustable variable.
So, can the united front against Russia actually stay united? Is Washington really an opportunist in a time of war? Joining me to discuss this, well, from Washington, D.C., we have Nicholas Lokker, who's a research assistant at the Center for a New American Security. Also in D.C., we have Marie Jourdain. She's a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. And from Berlin, we've got Dr. Thomas O'Donnell, who's an energy and geopolitics analyst. So, Nicholas, if I can open with you, does Europe have a point here that the US could be viewed as profiting or even profiteering from this war in Ukraine?
I would say that it's not too justified to make these accusations of the US profiting from the war in Ukraine. I think the two main accusations that have been leveled from Europe against the United States are, first, that U.S. energy companies are profiting through selling liquefied natural gas at a higher price to Europe, and then second, that the U.S. is benefiting through increased weapons sales to Europe. To take the first point about energy, this is not really accurate because most of the profits that are being made on these LNG exports to Europe are actually being made by the companies that are buying the LNG from the US and then transporting it across to Europe. And that's where the profit margins are coming. And actually, many of these companies are European rather than American. The two biggest, for example, are Total Energies, which is a French company, and then Shell. And then second, to take the point about weapons sales, the reason why the US is selling more weapons to Europe now is that many European countries have been depleting their stocks by sending weapons to Ukraine. And the best options that they see to replenish these stocks quickly is from the United States, which has a more robust and developed defense industrial base than Europe does at the moment.
If I can cross to you, Thomas, would you agree with that? My understanding is your position is the US isn't profiteering in this particular circumstance.
Well, thank you for having me today. Profiteering implies opportunism. The U.S., of course, will make a profit on weapons and or U.S. companies on weapons and on energy. But the reality is that there's the biggest land war in Europe since World War II. Russia has invaded a large European country. And the United States, I have to say, Democrat and Republican parties both, overwhelmingly for decades, have warned Europe they should be better prepared militarily. They should be better prepared as far as energy is concerned, not so dependent on Russia. That goes all the way back to Reagan, when the German and French governments promised during the days of the Soviet Union, when they first built these big pipelines from Russia, they promised they wouldn't ever become more than 15% dependent on Russia. So then to turn around, if somebody turns around and says, "Oh, the Americans are profiteering," it looks a bit strange. In fact, I don't think you'll find European leaders, serious leaders, saying that, at least not very often.
In the particular case of Europe buying all of their gas from Russia, though, was there not a separate strategic argument to doing that? Generally speaking, it's not a perfect rule of thumb, but generally speaking, trade partners tend not to go to war with one another because going to war with trade partners is expensive. You're not selling them anything anymore, which was exactly one of the reasons Europe was hoping that buying all of its gas from Russia would stop Russia from committing the acts that it has done.
As a strategy, this idea of, and I've heard many German leaders, German members of every major German party and some of the minor parties say that by trading with Russia, we'll end up being so interconnected, so interdependent that it'll be impossible to have war. The more center-left and left-wing, far-left, said they would refer back to Ostpolitics that started with Willy Brandt, and that being their example, the more conservative business people would go all the way back to the Hansa League in the Middle Ages, which was actually not true. They had all sorts of wars. Anyway, it doesn't work because your partner, in this case, Mr. Putin's regime, its highest aim was not simply trade and was not the profits involved. He could throw the oligarchs overboard, and he has thrown a lot of them overboard, in preference for seizing Ukraine and reestablishing Russia as a superpower, which simply he cannot do unless these former peripheral territories, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, and a couple others, are part of Russia. And so it didn't work. It was patently a failure.
Marie, this situation with the United States selling LNG to Europe and the LNG price having risen, does that not create friction between the US and its partners in Europe?
I think it's definitely a topic that is on the table, but as Nick Lokker said, it's also something about the contract that have been established way before, and that is just the markets. But the biggest issue, I will say, it's about perception, because you have the reality of what the competition is and who is profiting or not of this war. But the perception sometimes across the European public opinion is that actually you have US taking advantage of all of this, the economic difficulties in Europe. And so it's also not, it's about fighting also, I would say, this perception of who is responsible at the end of the day and how actually we can better work together between Europe, the Europeans, the EU and the United States, and to actually dismiss this narrative that will actually fragment transatlantic unity.
So can the United States in any way be blamed for Europe's energy problems, in your opinion?
I will say you don't have one energy policy across Europe. You have different countries who made different choices over the decades. So that would be the first point. Then, contrary to the United States, the European countries don't necessarily have all the resources. And so, you know, in the United States are a producer, while the Europeans are a client. And so they have to turn to other countries, may they be Russia or the Middle East or Americans or in Asia, like whatsoever. And so they have to address a new strategy for that. And so I think there's been a lack of strategy thinking on these issues for a long time. And the United States have been really stepping up, I will say, trying to provide more LNG. And with higher price, that's definitely one of the issue. But you have to work really together because you have this winter, of course, that is going on in Europe. But what happened in 2023 and in the years to come, coming winters to come, because it's going to take time. And so I will say you need to really work between the Europeans and the Americans on this, because it's not just, you know, an issue that will pop up in the next few months and then we forget about it. Like, this is really something that the Europeans need to address together, and that it will go also to other countries and to compete with, you know, to Asia, for instance.
Nicholas, Marie there is saying she wants to see Europe and the US work together. Obviously, everyone is going to say that. The question is here, motivations, and does everyone have, if you like, the same intentions? Now, as far as the United States and Europe are both concerned, neither of them especially want Russia to do well from the invasion of Ukraine. That's more or less a given. But there's a difference here between those who want the war over very quickly, preferably resolved in Ukraine's favor, and those who want to see Russia's military and its industrial base and the nation overall degraded in some way, to see it rubbed down. Do you think that there is a tension between the US and Europe in that they have different viewpoints on what they want out of the Ukraine situation?
Personally, I would say that the tension is less between the United States and Europe than it is differing viewpoints among countries in Europe. I think that you mentioned that some countries within the broad Western coalition that's supporting Ukraine have advocated ending the war sooner through negotiations. And I think people will point in particular to comments that for example, President Emmanuel Macron made this past weekend about offering security guarantees to Russia, when it comes back to the negotiating table. That being said, and that comment and similar comments that he's made throughout the war have angered some other countries, such as Ukraine itself, but also Poland, the Baltic states, etc. That being said, I think it was very, very clear from the joint statement that President Macron and President Biden put out after Macron's state visit to the United States last week, that the United States and France are both committed to eventually ending the war. The idea that eventually the war will need to be ended at the negotiating table, but at the same time, the time for negotiation is not now, and only Ukraine itself can decide when and under what conditions it would negotiate with Russia. So I really don't think that there are really differing positions or tensions between the United States and Europe on this issue of how the war ends. I don't think it's really too serious of an issue right now, but as the months go on, it could become more serious.
One of the things that is causing friction between the United States and Europe, though, is the US's new inflation reduction package that has been pushed through as a law. So, Marie, what do you think Europe is particularly angry about in a law that most people would look at and say, well, it's reducing inflation in the United States, or at least purports to do that? What on earth has it got to do with the Europeans?
There are several issues with the Inflation Reduction Act. First, I will say the European leaders were first very happy that the United States were actually investing massively in climate policy and for energy transition in the US. So that's the first point. One of the issues raised by the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed this summer by the Congress is that the United States are investing in through subsidies very much so. And so there's a big concern that the investments on energy transition and on climate policy that are currently in Europe would actually be diverted in the United States because their mechanism is quicker. For instance, if you're in a company in Europe, you may wait for 2 years to be actually to do what you want to do, while in the US it would be way quicker. So you've got this issue of a loss of investments, and also the fact that you have acquisition of protectionisms within the United States, so that European companies can actually not compete. So that was mainly the concerns that have been raised through Emmanuel Macron's visit last week. But also, I will say what we have seen from the Biden administration is that it was not intentional, and so they really committed to find solutions, not change the legislation, which is not going to happen, but maybe find ways out and find ways to adapt the application of the legislations for European companies to be able to compete better, and because the strategic goals of both the United States and Europe is to have decarbonized industries that are actually working, and so they both agree on that, and so you have a lot of alignment, but these difficulties cannot be underestimated, because it could raise a trade war that not Europe and not the United States want.
Well, let's have a look at that for a moment. President Biden, after it was put to him that he'd sort of forgotten about some of his European partners, had this to say.
The United States makes no apology, and I make no apology since I wrote it for the legislation you're talking about. So there's tweaks that we can make that can fundamentally make it easier for European countries to participate and or be on their own. But that is something that is a matter to be worked out. There is no fundamental, it was never intended when I wrote the legislation, never intended to exclude folks who were cooperating with us. That was not the intention.
So, Thomas, that's what President Biden had to say about being accused of his Inflation Reduction Act and his new green measures would hurt some of his allies. His defense essentially amounts to, whoops, sorry, we forgot you were there. Is that really a valid position for the US president to have?
I don't think that's what he said.
What's your take from what he said?
You were there. What he said, and what Mr. Kerry, who's his representative on these matters, said, is we're getting very serious about alternative energy. We're not abandoning fossil fuels insofar as we need it. We're not abandoning nuclear. We're not doing anything like, say, the Germans, who were creating a bit of a disaster inside their country with romantic ideas. We're going seriously into renewables in a reasonable way, and we're going to back them with tax credits. Tax credits are actually very different than what the Europeans have done. The Europeans have given all sorts of tens of billions of subsidies to companies for wind, for solar, and so forth. And a lot of that ended up being highly inefficient. The reason being, you get these, somebody who runs one of the biggest offshore wind fields in Germany, I showed him that the American wind farms were much more efficient than the German ones. And he said, well, no one ever looked at that because we know what our profits are going to be 30 years ahead because of the subsidies. In the United States, you have to actually produce energy, alternative energy, and you get a tax credit. So it's a different system. And I think Biden's being honest. If he steps on somebody's toes, he's willing to talk about it. That's pretty straightforward, I think.
Marie, do you think that's a reasonable position?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that Europeans and Americans had different strategy on this, and that if you're a European company right now, you might be more interested to go in the US under your soul because it would be much more efficient. And so I think at the EU level, you have a growing awareness that mechanisms are actually not efficient enough and not simpler enough. And so you have both tracks, I will say, try to address the Inflation Reduction Act legitimate concerns about protectionisms, etc., and what can be done at the European level only, because this is not US legislation that make EU mechanisms complicated. And so you really have these two separate tracks on this, and work to be done within the EU to make more efficient mechanisms to help the companies to actually stay invested in energy transition and climate policy in the EU.
Well, Nicholas, if I can come to you, if we have a look at the conversations that took place between Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron, obviously the two of them will have been discussing the nature of the aid that is given to Ukraine. If we have a look at the countries in the world that are the biggest donors to Ukraine in terms of aid, the majority of military aid by far comes from the United States with around $27.4 billion US. Obviously, the figures tick up. These are the October numbers. Next comes the United Kingdom at around $3.7 billion US, followed by Poland, Germany, Canada, Norway, Denmark, Latvia, Czech Republic, and Sweden. Now, those are raw total figures, and a lot of people will look at those and say, well, that's not entirely fair. What happens if we look at the figures by GDP per capita? And if you start doing that, it's fairly reasonable that you would expect Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland. These are countries that are terrified because Russia is right on their border. Those are the biggest donors. It doesn't matter how you slice the numbers, though, France isn't on either list. So is this not a problem with Emmanuel Macron meeting Joe Biden, talking about Ukraine, and France isn't one of the biggest donors or helpers?
The numbers that you presented are definitely, the numbers to a certain extent do not lie, with a slight caveat that not every country has disclosed publicly all of the aid that is provided to Ukraine. I know that France earlier on in the conflict, for example, was not disclosing all of the aid that it provided. So those are really, they're estimates more than they are to be taken at gospel. That being said, clearly this has caused a bit of friction, especially among some Republicans in the United States. We've seen Kevin McCarthy in the House of Representatives say that the U.S. isn't going to cut any more blank checks to Ukraine. We've seen other Republicans, such as incoming Senator J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley as well, call on the Europeans to step up their aid to Ukraine. So it has caused some tensions. That being said, I think that there's also recognition, especially from the Biden administration, that Europe is paying for the cost of this war in other ways the United States is not, in particular through the sacrifices that it's making to wean itself off of Russian energy and the economic costs of that, as well as accommodating many Ukrainian refugees that have come to Europe and all the costs associated with that. So I think that keeping in mind these other costs that Europe is paying the United States may not be is also very important.
Marie, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of truth in it, especially we shouldn't just look at military help, but also economic, humanitarian, financial aid, and what's happening also at the diplomatic stage, especially what France has been very active regarding energy security with the nuclear plant of Zaporizhzhia, or like what happened at the UN level. But really specifically on the military aid, I would just remind that France and actually Germany are the biggest contributors to the EU budget, and through that to the delivery of lethal and non-lethal weapons to Ukraine, which is now, if I remember, 2.5 billion, which is significant, really, and unprecedented for the EU. And also you have internal mechanisms of solidarity with the Baltic states. It's true, though, that France really didn't disclose a lot of its military aid and really focus on delivering what has been perceived as the most significant game changer, like the Caesar, for instance.
Thomas, if I can bring you in here, what's your take on this? Do you think that France is pulling its weight? What about it? I mean, somebody could very easily point to Italy, which is also a large economy, or Spain, which is also a large economy, and they're not donating large amounts either.
Yeah. Well, let me speak to France and Germany, the two so-called engines of Europe. The reality is, over the last decade or two, both Germany and France had a foreign policy where they thought, we're going to have a perpetual system of a global system of peace. No more big wars, no more big conflicts between great powers. And pretty much under the American umbrella, they could continue with their investments. Now, what France did, you could look at in 2019, Macron gave a talk to all his ambassadors who were back in Paris, like they do every year. And what he said to them was really quite striking. He said that, Europe was going down the tubes, basically, I'm paraphrasing, that it was going to vanish as a separate society. And only if Europe could be united with Russia from Vladivostok to Lisbon, as he liked to say, and there were Germans who would say similar things, could it remain relevant and use Russia as a strategic balance against what he saw as the two new superpowers, the United States and China. So Putin turned around and took advantage of this, thinking that Germany and France would side with him to impose a settlement in Ukraine. And they wouldn't. They wouldn't. Oh, no, we're not going to go that far. We're not going to be your boys or your girls here in Ukraine and impose some settlement. So he said, Europe is worthless. He went over their heads, and in December 2021, he gave an ultimatum to the United States about what he was going to do in Ukraine. Ignored them, and he went ahead and did it. So he expected in all this that if he went ahead with these aggressive plans, that France and Germany, because of the signals they were giving, would choose to stand with him. But they didn't. He didn't understand. What was more important to them was this global liberal trading system that and military system that the Americans had, and they went back under the American umbrella. That's
Thomas?
sort of in broad schemes how I see it. So there are differences, and there have been differences. But
Thomas, thank you very much for joining me. Nicholas Lokker, Marie Jourdain, thank you very much as well. That's all we have time for today's show. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. All you have to do is go to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But from me and from the entire team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.